Welcome to Wit Talk, a podcast by China Finance 40 Institute, a Beijing-based think tank. We have a strong track record of identifying major macroeconomic and policy trends in China. Tune in for independent-minded insights on China's economy, policy, markets, trade, and more. This episode is AI reproduced from the original conversation in Chinese.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wit Talk. I'm your host, Xiao Pao. Today, we have CF40 research fellow Zhu He with us. Recently, he published a report that really caught my attention. The moment I read it, I knew we had to talk about it. The title is When Electricity Becomes a Made-in-China Product. Before we dive in, let me explain why this report struck me so powerfully. The first time I heard the core idea behind it was actually months ago in Bangkok, of all places. I was talking with Dr. Guo Kai, executive president of the CF40 Institute, about Chinese manufacturing, about how a lot of us used to think this wave of Chinese companies going abroad was just a short-term response to tariffs, but now it's looking more and more like the beginning of a very long-term trend. The reasons go well beyond our complete supply chains. One of the biggest is cost, and that includes energy and electricity costs. And then, right in the middle of that conversation, Dr. Guo threw out this thought experiment. He said, what if we could keep pushing electricity costs lower and lower? And with the trajectory of renewables with solar and wind, what if the cost of power could approach something close to zero? What would China's manufacturing advantage look like then? The moment I heard that, I thought, wow, I had genuinely never considered that before, and it turns out that right around the same time Zhu He was deep in the weeds building models and writing this exact report. Since then, so much has happened. Chinese manufacturing's global expansion has accelerated far beyond what we expected. Profitability is actually rising. Then came the AI and computing boom. Elon Musk started saying that whoever controls the electricity supply would win the AI race. We're seeing the United States run short of power. There's this phrase now circulating in the industry. The end of AI is computing power. The end of computing power is electricity. And the end of electricity is China. Add to that the geopolitical shocks, Venezuela, the conflict in the Middle East, the Strait of Hormuz. And suddenly, everyone is reminded just how unstable traditional fossil fuel dependence really is. Countries are turning their eyes back to renewables, back to Chinese clean energy. All these events kept bringing me back to Dr. Guo's question, what does it actually mean? And then Zhu He's report landed. When electricity becomes a made-in-China product. After reading it cover to cover, I'll be honest, I felt a bit shaken. Not because the original idea was wrong, but because, according to this report, it could happen faster than I ever imagined and along a path that is remarkably clear. Zhu He, give us the big picture. What is this report really about?
Honestly, after hearing Xiao Pao's introduction, I realized she has insights into this report that even I didn't have while writing it. The whole thing started pretty casually. One evening, Dr. Guo Kai sent me a message. His basic question was, if you follow the logic of renewables, where generating power from the sun costs basically nothing, and then that near-free electricity can be used to manufacture more solar panels. Isn't that a self-reinforcing cycle? I thought, now that's an interesting question. So I opened my laptop and built a very simple iterative model in Excel. It was essentially an AK model, the simplest endogenous growth model you'd see in macroeconomics. The next morning I took the results to Dr. Guo and said, look, if this cycle can sustain itself, after some period of time, it enters a self-perpetuating loop. But the problem was obvious. There was no economic mechanism in it, no prices, no investment logic. It was just numbers. So that was the starting point, and from there, I kept digging and layering in more realism. It became what you called a thought experiment. When we do research, thought experiments are something we really enjoy because they help us see where the endpoint is. But the connection between a thought experiment and reality depends on how we relax those assumptions one by one. You have to keep walking it out of the realm of pure ideas. Take the core premise that the marginal cost of solar power can approach zero. This is standard marginal cost pricing in economics. Solar energy comes from the sun, and the sun doesn't send us a bill. So the marginal cost of one more kilowatt hour from an already installed panel is essentially zero. And under marginal cost pricing, the price should approach zero too. That's the theoretical limit. But in reality, of course, it's not zero. The main reason is that manufacturing the panels costs money. When you invest in solar, you have to factor in a price that recovers that investment. Let me give you an example. About 2 or 3 years ago, and remember, I don't come from an energy background. I wasn't a power sector researcher, and I had no idea of grid parity. I was doing some company field research, and an entrepreneur told me something that really stuck. He said the best investment he'd made in the past 3 years was converting his entire factory to solar power for his own use. I asked him why. He said, the investment paid for itself in 3 years. Where else can you get a 30% return right now? I had to admit, he had a point. For a lot of manufacturing businesses, energy consumption, electricity, is a major cost. And here he was, with one upfront investment, solving that problem entirely. $100,000 invested, and every year he saved $35,000 in electricity costs. After 3 years, he'd recovered the full investment. In the 4th year, that $35,000 was pure profit. That was one of many insights that came together as I worked on this. You start to see that China's development of renewables isn't just about carbon peaking and carbon neutrality. It's not just an environmental story. At its core, it's about fundamentally restructuring our entire energy system. So we kept adding layers to the model: how investment should be allocated period by period, how output gets distributed back into the system, how to incorporate market forces. Solar needs pricing, coal needs pricing, and their cost structures have to be designed properly. Layer by layer, we built what eventually became the model in this report. The model is really about 3 things. First, we believe that starting around 2023, China's renewables sector, with solar PV as the flagship, entered an acceleration phase that will continue roughly until 2035. Second, what this means is that China's overall electricity costs will keep declining. By around 2030, our average generation cost could drop by about 30%. Third, and this is the key mechanism that makes it all possible, renewable energy generation is fundamentally a manufacturing industry. And any manufacturing industry has a learning curve. The more you produce, the larger your scale, the faster your technological progress. The learning rate is the metric. For every doubling of cumulative production, how much does cost fall? In the solar PV industry, the global average learning rate is about 20 to 25%. But China has a unique, independently documented learning rate. There's a paper published in Nature that studied China's solar industry and found that China's PV learning rate is 33%, the highest in the world. When you put these 3 pieces together, you see that China's entire new energy trajectory has already passed its first inflection point. The first phase, from about 2015 to 2021, was driven by subsidies, by industrial policy, and it also created a period of overcapacity in solar. But looking back, my interpretation is, we had to push through the learning curve. You can't rely on market forces alone to accelerate that process. And once the learning curve kicked in, costs started dropping fast. We made it to 2021. The year of grid parity. After that point, yes, local governments may still offer some support, but that is no longer the main driver. Now China has essentially removed subsidies. All we need is a policy tilt. No restrictions on new solar investment, and no encouragement for new coal-fired power. That's it. No subsidies, no special incentives. The solar industry has entered a self-sustaining cycle.
Hearing you lay it out this clearly, I actually think you're underselling it. If you extrapolate from the report's conclusions, the implications are enormous. It could change a lot of things, but your logic is very accessible. I think listeners will grasp the main argument easily. There are, however, some fascinating details I want to pull out and examine with you. One image that probably forms in everyone's mind after hearing this is perpetual motion machine. We use manufacturing to produce solar panels. The panels generate electricity. The electricity powers more manufacturing of panels. And throughout this entire cycle, efficiency keeps improving and costs keep falling, driven by the learning rate you mentioned. It really does sound like a perpetual motion machine powered by a highly efficient self-reinforcing investment loop. And once you think about it that way, you realize it would change so many things, so many established logics. So let me dig into some specifics. First, the title. When electricity becomes a made-in-China product. At first glance, it seems unremarkable, but on second glance, something feels off. We normally say generate electricity, right? We don't say manufacture electricity. We manufacture phones, we manufacture cars, we manufacture all kinds of things, but not electricity. So I'm guessing you're drawing a line between different types of energy. The report talks about 2 kinds, consumable energy versus manufacturable energy. if we redefine electricity as a manufactured product, doesn't that fundamentally change the entire economic logic behind it?
That's right, and as researchers, we know that the title is almost always written last. When you start a project like this, you don't know the conclusion, you don't know where you'll end up, or what the most important insight will turn out to be. So the title only comes together when the report is basically finished. My original working title was When Electricity Becomes a Manufactured Product. Dr. Guo Kai changed it to When Electricity Becomes a Made-in-China Product, which basically spells it out explicitly. In the report, we walk through the logic. Since the Industrial Revolution, the defining shift was the large-scale use of coal. Oil came much later. The Industrial Revolution started with coal, with the steam engine as the driving force. That was when fossil energy, as a power source, drove the start of the entire modern industrial system. Then came the second industrial revolution, electricity. Electricity is not a primary energy source. It's a secondary form of energy utilization. But precisely because we discovered this secondary form, the universality of energy access expanded massively. The modern economy is fundamentally built on electricity. You cannot have industrialization without it. But before the second industrial revolution, that wasn't the narrative. People were still running on coal and steam. It wasn't until the first oil shock that developed countries really woke up to this issue. They weren't ready to act decisively yet, but they formed the Club of Rome and published that famous report, the core message being, don't depend too heavily on fossil fuels. You need new energy sources. Different countries pursued different paths, Japan, the United States, Germany, but progress was slow. The real acceleration of the entire new energy system only began after the year 2000, and the starting point was Germany, or really Europe as a whole. A side note here, if you look at Europe's energy consumption structure, especially in power generation, it's actually quite startling. Roughly 2/3 of Europe's electricity comes from sources other than fossil fuels, over 1/3 from renewables, about 1/3 from nuclear, and only the remaining 1/3 from fossil fuels. Europe's dependence on fossil fuels for electricity is far lower than most people imagine, certainly lower than I imagined. They've been working on this for over 2 decades, and the entire solar PV supply chain also started in Europe. They were the pioneers. It was around the early 2000s that China began to engage as well, and it's been an evolving story ever since. So in the early days of developing renewables, the thinking was, first, reduce dependence on fossil fuels. Second, these are clean energy sources, renewable and non-polluting. So, the motivation was gradual progress on those fronts, but at that stage, nobody had really extracted the manufacturing dimension yet, and the fundamental reason is it hadn't reached scale. A product has the attributes of a manufactured good when, and this distinguishes it from services, and certainly from traditional energy, it exhibits a learning curve. Services have learning curves too, but they're not steep. Think about washing hair, cutting hair, cooking. You go from novice to expert, and the more you do it, the better you get. But you get to the ceiling quickly. Manufacturing is different. The ceiling is much higher, which means the learning curve can be very steep. Modern agriculture is similar. The real efficiency gains in agriculture didn't come from farming at larger scale per se. They came from manufacturing, fertilizers, seeds, machinery. These things only become viable at large scale, and they're what truly drive efficiency up. But that's not an agricultural story. It's a manufacturing story. For a long time, if you look at the global renewables industry, scale was the missing piece. Or at least the speed of scaling wasn't fast enough. It wasn't until around 2015, when China started deploying solar at a massive scale, that renewables truly became a manufactured product. We didn't focus much on wind and hydropower in the report, by the way. The reason, both are geographically constrained. If a region lacks wind or water, you simply can't deploy them. But sunlight, while it varies by latitude and climate, is relatively evenly distributed. It's more universally accessible. So solar has a natural advantage in terms of deployment breadth. And that brings us back to the manufacturing point. All of this, panels, components, systems, these are equipment. The more you manufacture, the more proficient you become, the faster technology advances, the more deployment scenarios you discover, and the more feedback you get. That is the classic logic of manufacturing development.
I think this might actually be the single most important definition in the entire report. Because you've articulated it with such logical clarity, something that might have been a vague intuition is now crystallizing into a firm consensus. Electricity may have shifted from being a resource commodity to being an industrial product. That point is enormously important. If it's now an industrial product, then as you say, it is subject to the learning curve and scale effects of manufacturing. And the space for what that changes is vast. Let me press you on another detail. There's a compelling calculation in your report. You give a concrete example. A single watt of monocrystalline silicon PV module generates about 25 kilowatt hours over its life cycle. I've also seen studies showing that a full solar panel generates around 700 plus kilowatt hours per year, enough to power an entire household. Producing that panel takes only about 0.5 kilowatt hours of energy. So over its lifetime, it generates 50 times the energy invested in making it. That's a 50x energy return. It's like an enormous lever, a small initial energy input, a small initial investment, and the cycle can amplify indefinitely. That really is the logic behind the perpetual motion machine. Here's my question. How does a 50x energy return compare to fossil fuels? The energy return on investment, Niroi, measures how much energy you get out per unit of energy you put in. Crude oil, shale oil, they all have different ratios. Where does solar PV stand relative to traditional sources?
This is actually one of the more interesting conceptual points. In my view, only renewables really lend themselves to a meaningful discussion of energy return on investment. For traditional fossil fuels, the concept doesn't apply in quite the same way. When we talk about solar, we consider the full life cycle return, but that is theoretical. We also look at the energy recovery cycle. Take that 1 watt we mentioned, generating about 25 kilowatt hours over its life. How do we get that number? The panel's lifespan is about 25 years. Multiply that by daily sunlight hours and generation efficiency, and you arrive at roughly 20 to 25 kilowatt hours. The 0.5 kilowatt hours covers the entire production chain, upstream materials, component manufacturing, logistics, transportation, everything. So in about 1 year of operation, the panel generates enough electricity to offset all the energy that went into making it. But there's a catch. Solar panels can't produce silicon from nothing. All the raw materials represent real costs, and energy isn't the only input. For fossil fuels, the dynamic is completely different. An oil well, once you drill it, the equipment stays in place and you just keep extracting. The ongoing energy consumption of the well itself is minimal. If you tried to rigidly apply the EROI definition to both, traditional fossil fuels would actually score far, far higher than you'd probably imagine. Think about it. You drill one well, set up the pumping system, and it just keeps producing oil. So it's not simply a question of energy return ratios. We included that calculation to illustrate a specific point. Under the mechanism we're describing, renewables, especially widely deployable ones like solar PV, are at minimum not a losing proposition in energy investment terms. And that 0.5 kilowatt hour figure actually doesn't account for everything. Take energy storage. In the early stages of solar deployment, storage requirements are modest. You don't need batteries, or at least not at large scale. The sun shines, you generate power, you use it. That's the whole story. But the industry consensus is that once solar penetration exceeds about 20% of total generation, storage becomes mandatory. Why? Because at that point, solar is becoming a primary power source for certain sectors. But the sun doesn't shine at night. How do you handle nighttime demand? And you need to prepare for extreme weather. 2 consecutive overcast days, 3 consecutive overcast days. Once storage enters the picture, the energy and resource cost of manufacturing batteries is on a completely different order of magnitude from solar panels. And battery lifespan is around 8 to 10 years. That means over a solar panel's 25-year life, you'll replace the batteries roughly 3 times. When you add those costs in, the real energy return isn't as dramatic as the raw numbers suggest. But here's the good news, and this brings us right back to the core thesis. All of this is manufacturing. People talk about battery costs being too high. My view is that demand simply hasn't reached the tipping point yet. As solar penetration rises and battery demand follows, the battery learning curve will kick in too.
So scale is the key word throughout. What you just said about the fossil fuel comparison is important, because if we look at conventional oil versus shale oil, there's already a striking contrast. Early conventional oil fields might have had EROI ratios of 100 to 1. Shale oil came in around 5 to 1. People used to complain that shale was just too expensive. But if you stretch the logic further, extracting shale does require more inputs, more technology, more machinery than just sticking a pump on a conventional well. Extrapolate that all the way, and it converges toward the solar story. Manufacturing involves real costs, but once it hits scale, there's a predictable curve to follow. That's why I think discussing electricity as manufacturing is so meaningful in the context of the broader energy transition. Our demand for power, in theory, can keep expanding the scale efficiencies further. Now, you trace the history of energy development and mentioned Europe. The concept of new energy really did originate there. So here's the question. If this electricity perpetual motion machine really exists, if it really can happen, why does it appear to be happening only in China, or at least predominantly in China right now? I know the headline numbers. China accounts for about 80% of the world's solar PV production and a huge share of wind and other renewables. But is that the whole story? You keep coming back to learning curves and scale. Why can that only happen in China? What else is behind it?
Scale is probably the most intuitive way to understand it. Last year, there was an interesting news story. Some people in South Korea thought it was fake news that China consumes 1 trillion kilowatt hours of electricity in a single month. They said, how can any country use 1 trillion kilowatt hours in a month? Even the United States doesn't use that much. Well, it happened in China during the July peak summer load. That scale. Last year, China consumed about 10 trillion kilowatt hours of electricity. That's roughly equal to the United States plus Germany and maybe Japan on top. That's the magnitude we're talking about. There's another observation I'd make about Chinese policy and industrial development. We Chinese have two distinctive traits in how we approach things. One, when we decide to do something, we genuinely treat it as a serious undertaking. Two, we never treat big things as big things. We basically treat big things as small things, and that's why you see so much innovation emerge.
I actually didn't expect you to answer from that angle, but I think it's a deeper, more fundamental answer than what I had in mind. I was expecting you to say, China uses so much electricity because the world's manufacturing base is here. Industrial power consumption dwarfs residential use. The United States saw almost no electricity demand growth for years. Only now, with the AI boom, is it starting to tick up again. But most things in the world are made in China, and manufacturing consumes enormous amounts of power. I thought you'd also mention that the entire supply chain, from polysilicon purification to module assembly to ultra-high voltage transmission, forms a closed loop here in China. That the self-reinforcing cycle at scale requires all these pieces to exist simultaneously.
That's true, but all of those pieces being in place simultaneously. First, it's a process, and what we see now is the result. When we ask why it could only come together in China, the answer is still because we're large enough. There really isn't any other reason. Was it because we subsidized?
That's exactly what I was trying to tease out of you. What role did subsidies actually play? Because for years, the entire world, or at least the past few years, it has been saying you only got there through subsidies.
I don't think we should deny it entirely. In the earliest phase, subsidies played a very significant role. If we deny that, we can't explain why we were pouring money into renewables even when they were unprofitable. And it wasn't just solar panels. Subsidies for electric vehicles were substantial too. But in 2017, we decisively began phasing them out.
Now that you've brought up subsidies, let's really dig into this, because I think one of the most compelling parts of your report is the timeline. Once specific dates appear, a lot of people start seeing potential inflection points. Your model produces some very concrete timeframes. If I'm remembering correctly, solar PV takes off in 2022, costs accelerate downward in 2024, coal-fired power peaks in 2025, and by 2035, generation costs are 30% lower than in 2021. The natural question is, within this timeline, within your model's output, what role do subsidies play, both their existence and their withdrawal? What kind of variable are they, and how do they work?
Here's the key point. There are no subsidies in this model at all. None. The only policy intervention in the model is one thing, where new investment gets directed.
So your model has excluded subsidies entirely from the equation.
That's right. The model doesn't need subsidies. It only needs a decision about new investment flows. Are they encouraged toward renewables or left to a purely market-based allocation? New energy and coal power are two different forms of generation. Coal requires ongoing fuel costs. You have to buy and burn coal. For renewables, you make a one-time capital investment and then there's no additional cost. But you also have to consider the market price of electricity determines your return on investment. So it's a competition between two rates of return. That's the market mechanism. Then there's the policy mechanism. Say demand increases and there's a supply gap. How do you fill it? Purely by market logic. If you rely entirely on markets, coal is faster. You'd build more coal plants. So policy has to step in and hold that back. And this policy exists. In 2020, China explicitly announced that new coal-fired power capacity would be restricted in principle. Some of the coal plants you've seen under construction are actually replacement capacity. Now, China's coal power capacity has still grown over the past few years, but look at utilization rates. They've been declining. Our model projects coal-fired generation peaking in 2025, but honestly, I personally suspect it may have already peaked in 2024. In 2025, coal generation showed year-on-year negative growth. Even if 2026 ticks up slightly, the trend is unlikely to reverse upward. So think about it. You're looking at an industry where capacity utilization is visibly heading down. Are you going to add more supply? It's very hard to justify. To come back to the model, we set 2035 as the year when policy fully exits. After that, any new demand, wherever the new supply comes from, is purely a market decision. You calculate your return on investment, and the market decides. At that point, with the learning curve having done its work and electricity prices having declined, both forces will push new investment towards solar. There's a lot of detail in this, depreciation schedules, how we define demand, but that's the core mechanism.
So it's very clear. The model assumes policy exits in 2035, but the policy isn't subsidies. It's simply the guidance to prioritize clean energy over coal when adding new capacity. Once that guidance disappears, the market takes over. At this point, I have to say, the logical framework of your argument feels pretty bulletproof. If I were trying to find weaknesses in the machinery, in the key components, I'm struggling.
There's actually something interesting that didn't make it into the report. The published report represents maybe 30% of the work we actually did. For example, I tested different policy exit dates, 2030, 2035, 2040, to see what the differences would be. What I found is that the exit date doesn't affect the steady state. What it affects is time, how long it takes for solar's share of total generation to reach the long-run equilibrium level of around 70%. If you exit in 2030, the pace of solar deployment slows after that, but you still eventually get there. In our model, the steady state arrives around 2050, but we can stretch the horizon even further. I've run it out to 100 years. The finding is, once the mechanism is triggered, even if you exit today, you'll eventually reach the endpoint.
It's just a question of how long it takes.
Correct. The problem is, those 30 or 40 years in between represent an enormous efficiency loss.
In the long run, we're all dead, right? But what happens during the transition matters enormously. This is why I said the framework is solid. Changing certain variables may shift the timeline, but the trajectory holds. Exit in 2035, and we reach the steady state around 2050. Exit earlier, and the timeline extends.
Roughly speaking, exit in 2035 and you reach the steady state within about 40 years. If you hold on until 2040, 2041, 2042, you might actually overshoot. That would mean overinvestment, and you'd need to leave room for coal. Exit in 2030, and you might not reach the steady state until 2045 or later. So we're really trying to find the sweet spot. Our current assessment is that 2035 looks like one of the better candidates. It gives us enough runway.
That makes sense. But I think from a listener's perspective, let's zoom into the nearer term. What are the big factors in the short to medium run that could significantly jolt this timeline, or even trigger effects you haven't fully accounted for? Take coal. When you were building the model, I'm guessing you didn't predict the conflict in the Middle East would erupt, or that it would reshape oil markets so dramatically. The Strait of Hormuz has been closed for over a month now. We're already seeing coal prices rise, coal utilization ticking up in some countries. They're going back to burning coal because they can't get oil. China's energy supply is still adequate, but if the strait stays closed into June, July, August, if the situation gets even more extreme, could we be forced back toward coal? And how much would that disrupt your model's projections?
If we consider a shock like this and its impact on our framework, we probably need to think beyond just coal. On one hand, yes, in the short term it increases demand for coal-fired power, but at the same time it accelerates the entire energy transition. Think about countries like Thailand, like Vietnam. They're reportedly short on oil. So, what does their future industrialization look like? They have to think about this. Should they pursue a new energy transition? For China, this is even more relevant. Back in 2014, our energy security strategy explicitly called for diversification. A decade later, we're seeing just how prescient that was. Without that strategic direction, we'd have no ability to pivot. We'd be facing a massive instantaneous oil shortfall. As it stands, the situation is manageable. Let's do a thought experiment. What does China's energy mix look like in 2035? I think it's quite possible that by then, our net crude oil imports approach zero. All our domestic crude needs could be met by our own production. The big energy gap would be filled by coal and renewables. but filling different roles. Using coal and using coal for power generation are two different things. We can use coal for chemicals for many applications, and many things currently driven by oil will gradually shift to electric drive.
So you're saying that while my first instinct might be to point at rising coal use as evidence against your model, the shock actually creates countervailing dynamics. You mentioned Thailand. When we went there for field research last year, I remember the auto sales numbers, they were abysmal. And then just recently, new car sales in Thailand surged 70%, and most of them were EVs. BYD overtook Japanese brands for the first time. Japanese automakers dominated Thailand for over half a century. The driving force, people literally couldn't get gasoline. They still needed to drive. So within a very short window, they switched to EVs. That's one data point. But let me keep throwing curveballs at you. We talked about how solar manufacturing requires materials, and the sun may be free, but the panels aren't. What if key materials face export controls from other countries? What if a critical mineral is concentrated in a single country and geopolitical conflict disrupts supply? How big a constraint would that be?
For a country of China's scale, critical materials are definitely an important constraint, but the fortunate reality is that the vast majority of these resources are within our own borders. We're not reliant in the way some narratives suggest. There may be upstream materials, copper, aluminum, but solar panel manufacturing doesn't yet represent the dominant use case for these critical minerals. Even if some materials face supply shocks, the transmission to the overall solar manufacturing system is not unavoidable. There are substitution possibilities, efficiency improvements, and think about the feedback mechanism. As you said, if oil disruptions push countries back to coal prices rise. That means coal-fired generation costs rise. Doesn't that make the case for renewables even stronger? All relative prices move in that direction. If we're short on power, especially industrial users, and electricity prices float up with coal costs, what do you think companies will do? It's the same logic as Thai consumers switching to EVs. It'll happen fast.
All right, let me come at this from the opposite extreme. What if electricity demand explodes in a way we didn't anticipate, the Jevons paradox? Jevons observed that when steam engines became more efficient, coal consumption actually went up, not down. Britain started panicking about running out of coal. It became a national emergency. So here's the modern Jevons paradox. Electricity gets cheaper and cheaper, and demand explodes faster than anyone predicted. AI, computing, the token economy. Could power actually end up getting more expensive, not cheaper? Has your model accounted for explosive demand growth?
In the model, prices do play a role. Price affects the investment return rates for both forms of generation, and it also affects demand. There's an elasticity between price changes and demand. Only when prices actually decline does demand respond. I think we need to be clear about something. This demand isn't appearing out of nowhere. At current price levels, demand can't truly explode. The growth rate of electricity demand will only decline, trending toward 1% by 2050. But if electricity prices do drop significantly, the price elasticity of demand kicks in, and demand growth can pick up. The model captures this. We can set those elasticity parameters. Second point, yes, electricity consumption will certainly increase. We don't need to debate whether China's electricity consumption will plateau like developed countries did. Before AI, that might have been a reasonable assumption. With AI, the growth in power consumption becomes highly uncertain, or more precisely, the exact magnitude of increase is uncertain, but the direction is highly certain. That said, for China, even AI may not shift the fundamentals as much as people think. As you noted earlier, the overwhelming share of China's electricity consumption, both in total and in incremental growth, comes from manufacturing. Every country that has seen its electricity demand peak and decline has done so alongside the peaking and relative decline of its manufacturing output. So at least in the medium term, if China's manufacturing scale doesn't continue expanding dramatically, if instead it keeps moving up the value chain, the actual energy intensity of that manufacturing will decline. At that point, incremental demand from other sectors is manageable. It won't blow up the model. We keep coming back to the same baseline. China used 10 trillion kilowatt hours last year. To put that in perspective, the total electricity consumption of AI computing, even at its most aggressive projections, is on a completely different scale from things like aluminum electrolysis and copper electrolysis. They're not in the same league.
That's fair. I looked up some numbers. AI computing power in China could be growing at close to 40% annually through 2025. Data center electricity consumption in Hangzhou is up nearly 50% year on year, and Guizhou has spiked 95%. It is explosive in percentage terms. But you're right about absolute magnitudes. Let me shift gears now. Beyond the model, I want to explore some implications the report didn't fully develop. First, the future landscape of manufacturing nations. Could the world split into two types? One type, China, that can generate its own energy self-sufficiently through a self-reinforcing manufacturing loop. And another type, Southeast Asian countries, for instance, still dependent on traditional energy, still importing oil. There's this term floating around, industrial Cthulhu. It paints Chinese manufacturing as an unstoppable monster. It can make anything, and it keeps getting cheaper. If everything we've discussed holds, if electricity costs keep falling and China's overall manufacturing costs keep declining, does that lock China permanently into manufacturing? Because no matter how you calculate it, manufacturing in China will always be the optimal choice. Does manufacturing become our permanent destiny? Is industrial upgrading still meaningful in that scenario?
Looking at future manufacturing from an energy perspective is one valid dimension. But from a global perspective, ultimately what you get is two types of countries: those that can produce the vast majority of the manufactured goods they need and those that can't. For the ones that can't, who fills that gap? Countries like China, which can export manufactured goods at scale. In this configuration, the key variable isn't just the price or capability of manufactured goods, it's the exchange rate. Do you think Chinese goods are cheap? It's because the RMB-USD exchange rate is around 6.9 to 1. At that exchange rate, everything Chinese is cheap, but that cheapness is not sustainable.
Or you could even argue this is actually a good opportunity to raise our prices somewhat. From what we're seeing now, a lot of intermediate goods and other products, we initially thought the demand was tariff-driven, but now it looks like genuine rigid demand from many countries, and that demand is only growing. The supply-side advantage is on our side, so maybe we could raise prices.
If you raise prices, the main effect is on your export volumes. But it doesn't change your trade structure or your economic structure. In other words, without exchange rate adjustment, and maybe it doesn't need to happen overnight, the whole process, including what you called industrial Cthulhu, is a deeply distorted one. What's being lost is domestic welfare. Sure, people benefit from cheap manufactured goods, but economic transformation requires moving from manufacturing to services, because services absorb far more labor. That's the real direction, and without exchange rate adjustment, that transition is impossible.
Let me raise the second big issue that the report didn't fully develop, the so-called overcapacity narrative. We've taken a beating on this over the past few years. Criticism from the US, from the EU, tariffs everywhere. That's their narrative. But if you follow the logic of your report, I'd argue that what China is doing something good for the world, doing a service for all of humanity. If overcapacity was simply the price we had to pay, the larger the capacity, the lower the cost, the faster the cycle spins, then isn't overcapacity just the necessary scale condition for this energy perpetual motion machine? If China really is contributing to the world, not to put too grand a point on it, how do we fix that narrative?
In 2023 and 2024, we published a whole series of reports responding to this line of argument. The critics are confusing a fundamental point. For any emerging industry, the initial phase is very likely to involve overcapacity. In fact, it almost has to reach overcapacity first. Before that point, you can't really talk about a maturation phase or a consolidation phase. Every industry works this way. And in China's case, the critics aren't even arguing at the industry level. They're taking industry examples and applying them to the macroeconomy as a whole. The thinking is completely disjointed. If you want to discuss an industry, then focus on that industry. That case can be made clearly. If you want to discuss the macroeconomy, discuss the macroeconomy. But then your examples can't be cherry-picked from specific industries. The real problem China faced from 2022 through 2024 was a demand problem. The housing market underwent a massive adjustment, creating an enormous domestic demand gap. That gap between supply and demand suddenly opened wide. Look at the listed company data. In 2024, the year-on-year growth rate of capital expenditure in the manufacturing sector among listed firms was negative 10%. In the first 3 quarters of 2025, it was negative 3%. Apart from those few highly visible new 3 industries, EVs, lithium batteries, and solar products, where is the investment? Companies are actually contracting. The real task is to understand what's actually happening in our own economy. That's hard enough. If we can build a narrative that we ourselves believe, I think that's the most important thing.
I think getting others to believe it may require some external catalysts, but yes, the prerequisite is that we get our own logic straight first. We have to believe it ourselves. And I think recently we're getting more confident. Plus, external events have also been giving us a lot of unexpected supporting evidence. At least from where I stand, the trend looks very different from before. I have 2 more small questions, things the report didn't really address. The second to last, AI. If that widely circulated saying is true, the end of AI is computing power. The end of computing power is electricity. The end of electricity is China. And if Elon Musk is right that the decisive factor in AI competition is electricity, then in the US-China AI race, does this mean we're going to win?
When I think about this question, I genuinely struggle to wrap my head around it. AI, or this kind of transformative technological shock, whether it ultimately manifests as great power competition or as a reshaping of the entire economic structure, the implications are very different. If you frame it as great power competition, the mental model you're reaching for is the US-Soviet rivalry, who launches the satellite first, who lands on the moon first. You just extrapolate along that path.
Define winning first, right? Let's at least get that clear.
Right, that's one framing, but consider this. Britain captured the first industrial revolution, yet all of Europe benefited. The Industrial Revolution brought about the rise of Europe as a whole, and did it fail to give China opportunities? The self-strengthening movement, the 100 Days Reform, we were trying. It's not that the door was closed. Then came the electricity revolution. The United States developed rapidly. Europe caught it too. Germany and Japan rose after World War II. No argument there. The most recent one, the Internet revolution, clearly happened in the United States, and they moved fastest. But was China left behind? When we joined the WTO, our Internet penetration was abysmally low. Now we've caught up. The Internet revolution started in America and built the most mature network system. 20 years later, was that advantage decisive and insurmountable? Clearly not. The mobile Internet era after 2014. Same story. A technology can first emerge in one country, whether that's China or the US, it doesn't matter. But once that technology is inherently diffusive, I don't think we should analyze it through a great power competition lens. We should almost invert the framing. Ultimately, the question is, who handles it well, not who develops it fastest. Moving fastest might actually be a self-destructive process.
The silicon-based destruction of carbon-based life.
I'd go even darker. It really could be a self-destruction process. From that perspective, speed may not be a good thing. The question is whether your society is prepared to handle the shock. And in that calculus, electricity is probably the least important factor.
You've touched on something genuinely frightening, and I'm not sure I want to go further. So what you're saying is winning the AI race may be about who takes best care of the carbon-based life forms. And because if silicon is going to replace carbon at scale, the winner is whoever protects the humans.
That's why you're going to see more and more discussion of universal basic income. It's not mainstream yet, but it will be.
This is exactly what you said last time we talked. The most important question to be thinking about right now is what AI's continued advancement means for society. Everything else is secondary.
I genuinely believe that almost everyone, certainly every country, is unprepared for this and hasn't really thought it through. It affects how we should judge basically every major trend. When you factor in AI, the thing it directly impacts is employment. Right now, we keep reassuring ourselves that the displacement won't be that fast. Recently, I reread Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation, and it left a deep impression. I've actually come around to thinking we should have some faith in society's resilience. There will be a pushback. Sometimes the fact that AI might not advance as quickly as the technologists want, that might not be a bad thing, because society isn't ready.
One last question, and this is pure speculation, so feel free to think out loud. Everything we've discussed today started with a possibility that may never have appeared in human history before, electricity becoming a manufactured product. Then we extended it to AI and to a cascade of changes unfolding from there. If the transformations we're facing are genuinely unprecedented in human history, could they shake the foundational assumptions of economics, things like scarcity? And do we need a new economic logic to explain the Chinese economy?
Two thoughts on this. First, the foundational concepts and frameworks of economics aren't really about being overturned or not. Take scarcity, something that previously had no scarcity now has it, or vice versa, but scarcity itself as a principle underlying market mechanisms. That principle still holds under market conditions. Second, you mentioned things that have never appeared in human history. There's a distinction between something that has never appeared and something we've never considered. What we're doing, electricity becoming a made-in-China product, these are fairly practical, grounded considerations. Physics proposed the Dyson sphere long ago. How much of the sun's energy are we actually utilizing? An infinitesimal fraction. Science fiction has been ranking civilizations by their ability to harness energy at the planetary and stellar scale for decades. These ideas aren't new.
I think economics has a fairly narrow lens. The questions it can answer are limited in especially modern economics. The biggest underlying assumption is that you have to accept that whether the market economy is perfect or imperfect, there is a market economy. You can say our market economy is imperfect, but it's still here. My biggest realization over the past 6 months is that I think a lot of us, have massively underestimated the power of the market. The backdrop is so enormous that we often don't even realize we're standing on it. The real question is, what happens if that backdrop is removed? Is the market always going to be the optimal allocation mechanism? Marx said that when material production becomes very abundant, it means most things lose scarcity. And without scarcity, how do you price things? And then you come back to the real-world problem. What happens when labor has no scarcity at all? When supply is absolutely in surplus, what scarcity remains? How do you price wages then?
In that scenario, there is no market. Polanyi made this point from the very beginning. The labor market was the last market to be established because human beings resist being treated as commodities. The entire social system resists it. Commodity markets are relatively easy to establish. Labor markets are the hardest. He also discussed exchange rates, money. The financial markets establishment was another enormous transformation. My view is, we should stop dividing this into China versus the rest of the world. This is a problem all of humanity faces together. Its impact will be nearly undifferentiated.
So for researchers, is this the best of times or the worst of times? Depends how you look at it, I suppose. First, our field of economics can broaden, pull in physics, pull in other disciplines, cross-pollinate, learn from each other. Economics needs to expand, and at the same time, we should consider things that might have been invisible when the backdrop seemed permanent.
And here's a defining characteristic of modern economics. Not a flaw, just a characteristic. It's built on statistics. 2 implications. 1. All economic research now cannot proceed without statistical data. 2. All economic research cannot proceed without statistical methods. This creates a very direct limitation, especially for the biggest questions. If there's no statistical data for what you want to discuss, what do? You either don't discuss it, at least you can't publish a paper on it, or you create your own data, construct your own indices, find some unconventional source, scrape job postings from a recruiting platform, and build an AI displacement index or something. You can always find a way, but that kind of data-driven work and genuine, speculative, philosophical inquiry are completely different. The works that truly laid the foundations of modern economics. They didn't depend on statistics. They might have used some data, they might not have, but the real ideas were never constrained by data. They were exercises in reasoning and thought. So I agree with what Chinese economist Lu Ming has said. Economics needs to look inward more.
Wasn't it Keynes who said that economists are becoming less and less respectable than dentists? The profession has lost its craft. It was supposed to be a speculative social science. There's so much depth to explore. And then somehow it turned into a natural science, obsessed with models and statistics. Maybe we're now in the process of swinging back.
The initial direction was right. For a discipline to develop depth, as the questions we address become more specific, you do need data and a rigorous methodological framework. Otherwise, many important propositions simply can't be tested or discussed properly. That was genuine progress, but it's gone too far, at least in certain areas and certain types of research. Everyone knows this, and I'm hardly the only one saying it.
And that's exactly why I love reading the reports you and your colleagues write, because they always leave space. Your reports are different. The conclusions may come from the model, from the specific numerical results, but there's always something unspoken, something for the reader to ponder, to turn over in their mind. You'll give us the main findings, 3 conclusions, 3 discoveries, whatever you want to express. But within what you express, there's so much left unsaid. That kind of report is truly a pleasure to read.
Our final section is always conclusions and implications. Some reports are written for direct policy application, so those are very clear and pointed. But a significant portion, we can really only discuss implications. We see a result, we think it might have certain effects, but ultimately, those effects are still unclear. We're just offering a reference point, so it's not that we're deliberately leaving things unsaid, it's that we genuinely haven't studied those implications yet, and we don't dare to claim more than we know.
But it sparks endless connections in the reader's mind. I always read these reports backwards now. Start with the conclusion because it's so fascinating and then trace back. How did they think about this? What methods did they use? The logic, the approach, beautifully presented. All right, I think we've covered extraordinary ground today. Thank you so much, Dr. Zhu. Until next time on Wit Talk.
Thank you. See you next time.